this comes as a journey. I have never had, and I'm a pastor, right? For 53 years, I was a pastor. I've never had what you call a religious experience, or what is defined by many people as a religious experience. I have met and I know a whole lot of people who have had them. Well, I was beginning to study. This book is Toward a Psychology for the 21st Century. This is written by a group of people who are in the Department of Perceptual Studies at University of Virginia, where they've been studying abnormal experiences for over 50 years, like near-death experiences and those kind of things. And this is the results of 50 years of research. I found this fascinating. Well, then I picked up this book, which is a real fast read, and I would recommend it to anyone if you're interested in it. This is done by one of the professors, retired, at the University of Virginia, and his specialty was looking at near-death experiences. And this is his experience of 50 years of talking to people who have had NDEs and have had, done a lot of academic work in those. So if you're at all interested I've done this at the church, but if any of you are interested in taking a look at the book after, I would also be glad to do that. So that kind of brought me to a new book that came out, and it was called Encountering Mystery, Religious Experience in a Secular Age. So I'd like to start by doing a reading from Matthew Perry. Any of you know Matthew Perry? He played on Friends. He was one of the major players on Friends. He became a very serious drug addict, and was taking, my understanding is what he writes in his book is 50 to 55 Vicodin every day. And his stomach blew out, and they didn't expect him to live. And it's how he lived is an amazing thing. But something happened to him after that. And while I was preparing for this, my wife, Judy, said she was reading this book he wrote. It's called Friends, Lovers, and Big Terrible Things. And it's by Matthew Perry. He said, as I kneeled, a light slowly began to get bigger and bigger until it was so big that it encompassed the entire room. It was like I was standing on the sun. I had stepped onto the surface of the sun. What was happening? And why was I starting to feel better? And why was I not terrified? The light engendered a feeling more perfect than the most perfect quantity of drugs I have ever taken. Feeling euphoric now, I did get scared and I tried to shake it off, but there was no shaking this off. It was way bigger than me. My only choice was to surrender to it, which is not hard because it felt so good. The euphoria that began at the top of my head and slowly seeped down throughout my entire body. I must have sit there for 5, 6, 7 minutes filled with it. My blood hadn't been replaced with warm honey. I was warm honey. And for the first time in my life, I was in the presence of love and experiencing love, the acceptance and the filled with overwhelming feeling that everything was going to be okay. I knew now that my prayers had been answered. I was in the presence of God. Bill Wilson, who created AA, was saved by a lightning bolt through the window experience where he felt he was meeting God. This was mine. He goes on to say, I want to make sure I get the right page here. After about 7 minutes, insert a 7-minute joke here, the light began to dim. God had done his work and was off helping someone else. I started to cry. I mean, I really, really started to cry. The shoulder shaking kind of uncontrollable weeping. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because for the first time in my life, I felt okay. I felt safe, taken care of. Decades of struggling with God and wrestling with life and sadness and drugs had been washed away like a river of pain, gone into oblivion. I had been in the presence of God. I was certain of it. This time I had prayed for the right thing, help. Eventually, the weeping subsided, but everything was different now. I could see color differently. Angles were a different magnitude. The walls were stronger, the ceiling higher, the trees tapping on the windows more perfect than ever, their roots connected via soil to a planet and back into me, one great connection created by an ever-loving God. And beyond a sky which had before been theoretically infinite, was now unknowably endless. I was connected to the universe in a way I had never been. Even the plants in my house, which I had never noticed before, seemed to be in sharper focus. I stayed sober solely on that moment. I'll lay these down here now. That is an encounter, a spiritual encounter. How you take it, how you view it is your own view. But he says this changed his life. It was real. And there are 4 things here that are normal in most religious experience. One is you don't ask for it. It comes. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist, an agnostic, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Taoist. It doesn't matter at all. An agnostic, it can happen and does happen to just about anyone. The second thing is that when you experience it, you have no words for it. And so the words spoken by almost everyone who has a religious experience are metaphorical. Because there are no words for what they've experienced. And they will say oftentimes, I have no words for this. And then you say, well, go on, tell me about it. Like, okay, what are the words that you've got to express it? If you look through the Bible and you read it with your eyes open toward this sort of thing, you find most of the Bible is metaphor. For example, Moses seeing the burning bush. Did he see a burning bush? Or was that an experience that the only way he could explain was by saying there was a fire, a burning fire, a bush that was alive? I've often asked how many people walk by the burning bush without ever seeing it. Then not only is it metaphorical, but it is almost always life-changing and life-affirming. A sense of being connected with the universe, a sense of overwhelming peace, a sense of being connected with Allah, Yahweh, Elohim, God, the Tao, whatever you want to call it, that which is larger than ourselves. Mickey Rooney had an almost similar experience. And what happened to Mickey Rooney, he was in the hospital and he was about ready to take his own life, and he was very ill, and he's had all sorts of tragedy in his life. And while he was there, he experienced a light, a person who came in and changed his life. My son, Joshua, suffering from bipolar, I was running down to Kalamazoo. I can't tell you how many times a week, because he would call up in either a manic or depressive state. And I couldn't bring him up here because he was being treated as an outpatient at Borges Hospital. And when I asked if I could bring him home so we didn't have to we're paying his rent, doing all that sort of thing that parents do. And I said, can't we bring him back to Alpena? And they said, no, there isn't enough psychiatric care, they thought, up here. I'm not going to get into that. And then one day he called me and he said, I'm healed. Now I get a little weepy at this point, usually. He said he was sitting there at the bottom of his depression and that he was going to take his life. He felt there was absolutely no hope in the world. And I have depression, so I know what that feels like. It's not fun. And so he said he was contemplating, he had suicidal ideation, I guess is what you call it. And all of a sudden, he said he felt a warmth at the top of his head, and it flowed all the way through his body and came out of his feet. And he's fine. He's not using drugs. He's an engineer, has a family, 3 wonderful kids. And he said he was healed by God. Now, my son is not a religious person. He does not go to church. But he meditates and prays every morning. He thinks the church has missed the boat entirely because of that experience. So I went to him being a father and I said, okay, so you had another manic phase and you think you got touched by God. That's the way I act, you know. I'm a skeptic. I said, sure, that's what happened. He said, no, Dad, this happened to me. And I said, you probably were just getting out of your depressive state into a more normal state, and you think you've been touched. No, this is different. This is real. This is different than anything else I've ever thought of, I've ever felt. And to this day, he says it was God. And the reason he says the word God is he doesn't know what else to call this sacred, this holiness. As a pastor, I have seen this kind of things on multiple occasions. And usually I'm very skeptical of them. There is a theory that is growing more and more in the area of psychology, is that the brain does not create consciousness, which has been the typical materialistic appointment, but that there really is no there. As you go down further and further into the atom, into the quarks and the up quarks and down quarks and all that sort of stuff, and you move down to the quantum field or whatever you want to call it, that what the brain does, it's a transmitter of consciousness. It's like a television set. A television set like this is sitting there with a blank screen. An example I often used when I was preaching was with kids. I would take out a radio and turn the dial when it's on, and you get all sorts of different channels. Now, does that mean that when you shut the radio off, those radio waves are not there? No, it's just when you turn the dial to the right channel, all of a sudden it comes to life. It's not producing, but it is transmitting something. And so all the way back to the beginning of William James. I don't know if many of you know William James, a great famous, he's by some the founder of American psychology, came up with this idea back then, and it is gaining more and more popularity. John Wesley, a Methodist, had what he called the which has 4 pillars: Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. When I went to seminary, we studied Scripture. I did the Greek and the Hebrew and all of that, and you studied scripture. You studied philosophers. My favorite were Alfred North Whitehead and Paul Tillich in the 60s. So you studied rational thought on religion and tradition. So you studied church history. How did we get to where we are now? How has the church changed? How has the faith changed over 2,000 years? The fourth one was experience. We never talked about that in seminary at all. Zero, zip. And if you started talking about one of my favorite, Urban Holmes, was an Episcopal professor down south, said, we pastors spend time telling people they ought to pray to God. And when they come and say, well, God answered me, we send them to a psychiatrist. Because you're supposed to talk to God, but if God starts talking to you, well, that's different. This book is written by Dale Allison, and he is the professor of New Testament studies at Princeton. He is a well-known academic who has only written very academic kind of books. If you don't know Greek and if you don't know Hebrew, you're probably going to have a rough time with them. They are written for other academics. He is now about ready to retire. And he said he never was able to express the religious experience that he had, because even in seminary, if he expressed this, people would think that something was wrong with him. And that's the other thing that happens with religious experience. About 90% of the people who have religious experience don't talk to their spouse about it, let alone talk to their friends, their neighbors. And one woman, there's a story in the book, went to see her pastor, and the pastor said, "You're in menopause." That didn't help her. I don't know whether she was or not, but she swears that what she was feeling had nothing to do with menopause. But we kind of walk away from it. We don't know what to do with it. We're uncomfortable with it. We don't know, because I cannot experience your experiences. The experiences that I have are mine, and no matter how hard I try, that's why we have music, that's why we have poetry, that's why we have art. Because I can't in words tell you what I experience. My experiences are mine, yours are yours, and we can talk to one another about them. But as I've often said, I've been married to my wife for 53 years, and I still love her, and I say I love you, and I stop and I think, no, I really love you. No, I love you. Do you understand? The words just don't convey everything I want them to convey. And so we're caught in this bind of religious experience is something which we cannot express normally. And it is something that is experienced, if we haven't experienced, is experienced by someone else. Well, in this book, he goes through all sorts of different religious experiences. And so what I would like to do is, if you got the one that says Encountering Mystery by Dale Allison, you will notice that on the third page, it says break for questions and discussion. So what I'm planning on doing is breaking at that point. And I want you to think about your response to spiritual experiences. Now, I don't need any of you to talk. You know me. If nobody has questions, I'll continue to talk. But oftentimes I find that people do want to talk about this. One of the things that William James, in his famous book, Varieties of Religious Experience, says that churches, when once established, live at second hand upon tradition. I'll say that again. Churches, when established, live at second hand upon tradition. In other words, most people in church, if you were to say, did you have a religious experience that brought you to church? They were raised in the church. They know the teachings of the church. They have a feeling for God and that which goes beyond them. But they're like flowers that have been cut off from its roots. They'll live for a while and then they'll die. And I happen to be one of those who believe that one of the reasons the church is dying is that we have separated ourselves, and I am at fault for this more than most people probably. We have cut ourselves off from our roots, which is our experience. The last thing in the evangelical and Reformed church where I grew up and now in the United Church of Christ, you talk about in church is religious experience. How often in the Presbyterian church does someone stand up on Sunday and say, I want to talk about my experience with God? Well, maybe nobody had one, but we don't even talk about not having them. We, in the mainline church, basically do not talk about it. And in the Catholic Church, it's the same, most often, not always. And you're supposed to let the pastor have the experiences and do all that and then tell you what it's all about. Well, he says, churches, when once established, live at second hand upon tradition, but their founders of every church owed their power originally to the fact of their direct personal communion with the divine. Whether it be Buddha, whether it be Moses and the burning bush, whether it be Abraham. And if you look at the Bible as metaphor and poetry, rather than cold history and fact, what you find is it is loaded with people trying to express to others the mystery of the holy. We used to call that mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the great and tremendous mystery. Not only the founders of Christ, the Buddha, Muhammad, but also the originators of this Christian sects. And you could go through that. I said sex, not sex, by the way. Francis of Assisi, Bernard of Clairvaux. All of them have energized the church at particular points in times, are energized faith, and without some sort of religious experience, the church dies. And so we always talk about, can we add new hymns? Can we bring a thing that flips down from the front so that we don't have to look at our hymnals? Can we move the chairs out, take the pews out and put them in a circle? We can think of all sorts of arrangements for the deck chairs on the Titanic. But that's all we're doing is arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And the proof is in the pudding is that those churches, most churches that try that are experiencing not a lot of growth. The churches that are experiencing growth, even in the liberal tradition that I come from, and I come from probably one of the most liberal traditions of the Christian faith, and I affirm that, is those churches that are willing to talk about the holy as being real and present. Behind, beneath, and beyond the mundane face of the world, and secreted within our daily lives, is some fundamental, mystical, affectionate reality. Now, here's some statistics. You know, I would have to give you statistics. In the year 1962, there have been over decades surveys done that ask the question, have you had a religious or spiritual awakening, an encounter with the holy? In 1962, 22% said yes, 78% said no. In 1976, 31% said yes, 69% said no. In 1994, 33% said yes, and 65% said no. In 2006, 47% said yes, and 51% said no. And in 2009, for the first time, more people said that they had encountered a religious experience than said they didn't. 49-48. And the people I were reading here say that that number has probably grown so that it is more than that. An atheist psychologist, Geneve W. Foster, had an experience, in her words, was so far from unusual with my outward eye, but I nevertheless knew that there was someone else in the room with me. An expectation so far from anything that I thought in the realm of the possible that has taken me the rest of my life to come to terms with it. She's writing this, I think, when she's 90. Here is what she says happened. I saw nothing a few feet in front of me, and a little to the left stood a numinous figure. And between us was an interchange, a flood, a flowing both ways, a love that flowed both ways. There were no words. There were no sounds. There was light everywhere, indoors and out. The world was flooded with light, the supernatural light that so many of the mystics describe and a few of the poets. The vision lasted 5 days. Sometime on Saturday afternoon, I had a sense of fatigue, and I could sustain it no longer, and it faded. I've never had an experience like that. I don't know if any of you have or have not, or if you know someone. Here's some experiences. This is what I call a free-floating experience. In other words, you don't ask for it. It just comes and it hits you. And one of the things that is said by, I think, everyone, but there's always somebody out there that will prove me wrong. The vast majority, the one thing they say is an overwhelming sense of love, of belonging, not just to themselves and their family, but belonging to all races, all creeds, the world itself, the universe itself. There is a sense that there is a love that flows through everything, that they have been allowed to pull back the curtain and experience. And there are several of those. I've read some of them to you. I could read to you. There's a whole book of people who talk about their religious experiences. There is an interesting thing, and it's in the book, and it's not active right now, but someone developed a website for scientists. And the website for scientists was so that they could explain their experience without being castigated by their fellow scientists. Because one that many of them will say is, I want to get tenure. If I go around talking about experiencing God, and some would say I was denied a grant because I said I had a religious experience. And so he developed this website, and the only way you can get on it is to be a certified scientist. I don't know how you do that. But it's just loaded with scientists who are afraid to share their religious experience because their colleagues will denigrate them. This gentleman who wrote this book, I was beginning to tell you, one of the reasons he's about ready to retire, he's writing the book, because he had this experience, 3 of them, when he was a teenager, and he was afraid, even when he began to try to talk about this, that number 1, he wouldn't be hired, number 2, he wouldn't get tenure, and number 3, he wouldn't get grants. And so he waited until almost he retired. The other one that I have encountered on more than one occasion is a DBE, deathbed experience. I have been at the bedside of, it's been my privilege to be at the bedside of several people as they die and before they die. Recently, within the year, I have been at the bedside of two people. Both of them were talking to relatives at the foot of the bed who had died long before. And they swear that they see them and they talk to them. About, later on, I will go into it if we have time. They've done all sorts of statistical studies of deathbed experiences. And it is a huge, huge number of people. And oftentimes they're not shared because, their mind is going or something like that. And they don't. And this goes back, the study of this goes all the way back to Hippocrates, Cicero, Plutarch, and Galen. There has not been a time in our history that people have not reported and talked about deathbed experiences, except the 20th century, where they almost disappear and are now coming back again. I am making no claims except to say that these people say they are real. They have experienced them. And sometimes, not always, in fact, fairly rarely, the person in the room with them sees the person also and talks with them. This usually happens about 2 weeks before death until hours before death. It doesn't happen out, and it get more likely to happen the closer and closer you get to death. The other one is, and this one, I don't know, this one blows my mind. Terminal lucidity. I have not experienced this one, but there are a lot of them. And that is the reemergence of normal or unusual enhanced mental abilities in the dull, the unconscious, or mentally ill patients shortly before death, including considerable elevation of mood and spiritual affection, or the ability to speak in previously unusual terms. Now, that I've seen. I think if you've been around dying people, you often see just before they die, the weeks before they die, the hour before they die, all of a sudden they become like they're well again. They feel fine. They talk. I've seen that more. That I've seen a lot. But here I'd like to give you Scott Haig, Dr. Scott Haig, I should say, a medical columnist, clinical professor of surgery at Columbia University College. So he's got great, Columbia University is a pretty good university. And he was a professor of surgery there. Had a patient named David whose lung cancer, as so often happened, had metastasized to the brain. David's speech as a result was slurred. Then he became incoherent. Then he could no longer move. He eventually became wholly unresponsive. And according to Haig, he showed no expression, no response to anything we did to them. And as far as I could tell, he was just not there. A scan revealed that the cancer had eaten most of his brain. Yet an hour before his death, and after he had already begun to breathe irregularly, he awakened, he smiled, he spoke clearly to his gathered friends and held their hands, said it was time to go. Only then did he slip away. The attending nurse opined that it was like a miracle. This was Haig's verdict. It wasn't David's brain that woke him up to say goodbye that Friday. His brain had already been destroyed. The tumor metastasized don't simply occupy, his brain had already been destroyed. Tumor metastasized don't simply occupy space and press on things, leaving a whole brain. The metastasis actually replaces tissue where the gray stuff grows. The brain is just not there. A thing I've often thought, if somebody asks you, are all swans white? Right? And I would always say, yes, all swan. Have you ever seen a black swan? I went to Stratford on the Ontario in Canada, and there was a black swan. So that means I no longer can say that there are no black swans. Now, up before that, I was just wrong. If I say there are no black swans now, I'm lying because I've seen one.
So good. Bunch of black ink.
No. This is a real swan and really black. Yeah, and really black. And but the thing is that once you see it, you have to deal with it. You can't just say it isn't there anymore. Nothing hinted that she was recognized anyone. Oh, excuse me. Even an Alzheimer's patient can exhibit terminal lucidity. One 91-year-old woman who had been wholly unresponsive for 5 years. Nothing hinted that she recognized anyone, including her daughter, who was her caretaker. Nevertheless, a few minutes before she died, she began to engage in a coherent conversation. She spoke about death, her church, her family, her daughter. Her daughter was absolutely baffled at her mother's momentary return to the earlier articulate self she was. These last two accounts do not only illustrate terminal lucidity, but give us a sense of what is usually communicated. It's time to go. Love, holding hands, those sorts of things. So that's number 3 is terminal lucidity. The other one, I know of 3 people who have experienced this. Obviously, I would not have experienced this one myself, but all 3 of them said, we happened to be in a conversation and they said, I want to share with you something, Reverend. I've never told anyone else. That becomes, and that was a near-death experience. These people were clinically dead and suffered one of them a massive stroke, and yet believed that she met relatives of hers that died years before and was told by them, and this often happens in a near-death experience, it's not time for you yet, go back. And sometimes they'll say, no time for you yet, in 3 weeks, and the person dies in 3 weeks. I'm just reporting what is reported here. I'm not making any judgment about them. But there are millions, and it's important we realize this, there are millions of Americans who have had near-death experiences. Near-death experiences are recorded in every continent in the world except Antarctica. I wonder why not there, but every culture, every religion, non-religion, of all these cultures record. And now that NDEs are more likely to be talked about, we're discovering that there are literally millions of people statistically in the United States who've had some sort of near-death experience. The one thing that is with all of them is this phrase, almost always like this if you're speaking in the English language. It was more real than real. Don't tell me it wasn't real. It was real. I saw it. I know it. I believe it. And there's almost always a change in lifestyle afterwards. They give, for example, a sergeant in the Marines who left because he couldn't carry a gun anymore, because he realized that we are all one, and he literally could not carry a gun. And one of the things that happens to many of these people who have NDEs is they change so radically, the people around them don't know what to do with them, because they become kinder, they become gentler, they become more loving, they become more open to different experiences. And they haven't got time for things like money. That's another one that gets in trouble, because they come back. And I'm thinking of one where the wife said he had a near-death experience and now he's giving all our money away, which may not be a good thing. But and I don't know what she meant by our money away, but he was a hard-driving, hard-working person whose goal was to make more money. And all of a sudden, when he came back from his NDE, he said, that's not important. Not that he went and gave up on money altogether. We have to have that to live. But this was no longer a driving force in his life. It was inconsequential to the things that really count. Does that make sense? That's happens. An after-death experience. This happened to my mother, and I wish now I had thought more about it when she said it, because she's gone now too. About 2 weeks after my dad died, she lived over here on Island View. I was over to visit her to see how she was doing, and she said, I talked with your dad last night. Sure, Mom. Yes, Mom. You talked to Dad last night. Yeah, right. You think you did? I believe that you think you did, but I'm not so sure anymore. I'm not so sure she did, but I'm not so sure that she didn't. I have known, as a pastor, several people who have talked to very close loved ones who have died. And usually it's just a few minutes or a few seconds. It's not like I carried on not like they're giving a speech in front of all, but it's just they have seen that person, and that's they're thinking now about 40%, which means it's still a minority, but it's and that's called an after-death experience. A healing experience I've just shared with you. A hidden world of prayer. The only thing I know is I don't understand prayer at all. I mean, I've been a pastor for 53 years. I don't understand it. Because why do some prayers seem to be answered and others not? And why does, I just have a real hard time with thinking that prayer is a mechanism to manipulate the sacred. But I had a teenager in Lewiston who was a member of the church, who they went in to take a mass out of her stomach, and the doctor, they had done all the tests that you need to do, and just before the surgery, they took one more and it was gone. The doctor came out and said, maybe it was water. Maybe it was something. I don't know. But they didn't do the surgery because, and he says, I'm glad we did that because it's not there anymore. I really have a hard time with that one, to be honest with you. A couple of experiences that I've had, I may have shared the two that I'm going to share, and I never counted them as religious experiences, but when we get into the book, it might do that. My father had died, and a few years later, my mother died. And I was sitting in the parsonage over on 2nd and Lewis Street. And I'm pretty hard-headed. And my wife said, "Look at that plant." I said, "What plant?" "Look at that plant over in the corner." "Okay, I'm looking at the plant. So what?" "Bob, look at that plant." That plant we got at my father's funeral never bloomed, ever. The day of my mother's funeral, it bloomed and never bloomed again. When I say that, it just sounds like coincidence. I can't explain it. And as soon as I start trying to explain it, it sounds like I don't know what. Another one, and you could talk with Maggie Michaud about this one. Those of you who know Maggie, I was a hospice chaplain for a volunteer hospice chaplain for several years. And I went to visit this woman who the hospice was dying. And she was being told about the dragonfly. I didn't realize that the dragonfly is a symbol that some hospices use. And if you go to the hospice walk, you'll see dragonflies as you do the walk. Person sitting with her says, "Well, a dragonfly is somebody trying to tell you something who's gone." Okay. So, okay. Story. There are no dragonflies. It's too cold. We're out at Evergreen Cemetery and we're getting ready to lower the casket. In flies a dragonfly and lands on the casket. I finish the prayers of committal and it flies away. Wonderful. Yeah. Well, it is. It's comforting. But I have heard from other people after services that they feel that there has been something like a rainbow when it's not raining kind of thing. Something like that dragonfly occurs. And again, that's only happened to me once, and I've done hundreds of funerals. So, it's not like something that maybe it was just coincidence. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh dear. Am I going to be on television? Okay. Tom's mother just passed recently, and he was up, and she lives in Iron River, and he was up there, and we knew the end was coming. And so that night I was just really praying and really talking to her, soul to soul. And I said to her, "It's going to be okay. You're not going to pass alone." I truly believe that. I truly believe angels were there to help her. And the family comes. I mean, God would not let you do this alone. So I got up in the morning and I'm sitting in my recliner and I'm looking out the window. And the most beautiful sunset. It was sunset came up. Sunrise, I'm sorry. Sunrise came up. The sky was just pink and it got pinker and pinker. And I knew in my heart that Wilma had passed. And then I heard later on that she had passed. And then Lisa gave me one of their plants they have. I don't think you know that yet, Tom. And it's a Christmas cactus. And the other day, there was a big bloom. And that's Wilma telling us everything is okay.
Because everything that stop there in Florida where you go off into the own Jesus. We have an argument. I know you. I just say, well, we have to connect to see if there's about the good. Anything. We need to do it. It's like, you know, you don't want to get sunrise or something like that. It's perfectly get that way. But I think it so many times. Don't want to, by the way, want to say what they say. The thing is, I mean, well, what is that? I know I feel it was the first thing I was where the video is good, there is one very significant. When it is done, the solid person market to see something, or rather to speak more exactly, to become conscious of something present, for actual sight is out of the question. A very striking kind which remained invisible to the unperceived by the assistants. Again and again, this instant is repeated. It is described almost in the same words by persons who have ever heard of a similar occurrence, and who suppose their own experience to be unique, and have raised no theory upon it, but merely consider it to be curious or affecting, nothing more. It is invariably explained that the dying person is lying quietly when suddenly, in the very act of expiring, he or she looks up, sometimes starts up in bed, and gazes on what appears to be vacancy with expression of astonishment, and sometimes develops instantly into joy, and sometimes cut short in the first emotion of wonder and awe. I was watching one night beside a poor man dying of consumption. His case was hopeless. I'll wait on that one. It is now established beyond a doubt, for instance, that a surprisingly high percentage of dying have visions of some other realm, or report seeing deceased loved ones or angelic beings. It also has become quite clear that many can sense in advance of death is drawing near. The hospice folks has a name for this, nearing death awareness. Oftentimes, if you are with a person who knows that they're dying and they're getting closer to death, Pope John the 23rd did this. It is a quintessential example of this. He was very, very old and getting ready to die, and he said, "It's time for me to pack my suitcase." An image of packing suitcases or traveling or going from one place to another becomes very prominent. Not that I'm going to die, but it's time for me to take a trip. It's time for me to get ready to go. You know, things like that. So what John 23rd said when he said, "I'm getting ready, I'm packing for my journey," it was like, oh, yeah. I don't know if he knows it or not, but I didn't at the time, that's a very common phrase. In a 2005 study, over 500 hospice patients. Now that, again, this is 2005, 500 hospice patients and their caregivers in the in the US reported the following: 85% of the 500 patients had survival-related visions. 90% of these reported seeing parents and siblings. 90% saw angels. 30% reported seeing God or Jesus. 5% saw evil beings. So I'm going to stop there and just say these are one of the things the church needs to realize is it has to become more tender and less legal. I don't think God cares if you believe in the third phrase of the Nicene Creed. But he does care if you're a person of love and of compassion. And that what's wrong with the church now is that we are, I don't know, too cold. But I don't want to say that either. Now, also what you have here is an addendum that I'm not going to talk about. I just wanted you to have. So let's stop. Are there questions? Anybody want to make comments?
This is my personal belief. We have all lived inside the box our whole life. We've all done what we have been told for centuries that's right. We're now getting out of the box. We are now searching for our spirituality, and we are connecting all the time with God. And I commend you for coming here and talking about this.
It has, maybe it's because I'm almost 78 and getting ready to make the journey myself, but I don't think so. When I talk to parishioners, I don't do that anymore. When I used to talk to parishioners, they just want to know that they're loved and that their life is full and their life is meaningful. And a lot of times the stuff they spent their whole life doing is a crazy thing. When I was in high school, I thought, what I want to do more than anything else is go to college. So I went to university and studied philosophy and non-Western religions. I thought, well, what I want to do is go to seminary and then I'll be happy. And so I went to seminary, spent 4 years there. Then I spent 5 years in the pastorate and thought, well, if I get my doctorate, then I'll be able to. So I went back to school for another 3 years and got my doctorate. It was always, but none of them completed like you would hope they complete. Does that make sense? It's like it doesn't long-term satisfaction. It's like a hit of drugs. It works now, but it's going to wear off. And I've just seen so many people. Like I said, I don't know how many people I've seen. They say they're talking to somebody. You know what I'm saying? And the thing is, the more drugs they're on, the less likely it's going to happen. I mean, if they're in a hospital taking lots of drugs, it actually suppresses the ability to do this rather than enhancing it. There, at least the studies that I've seen, that seems to be indicated is it isn't drugs. These are not drug induced. They're drug stopped. So the more drugs the person is on, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be. I'm just saying the more drugs they're on, the less likely they are to have one of these experiences. Any other? And don't ask me to tell you what to do with this because I don't know what to do with all of it. So, well, then I'll go to the appendix for just a second. If you go to page 4, just for a second, another study from early 2000 is an online survey found that 218 out of 525 caregivers and doctors reported deathbed experiences or deathbed visions. That's not having one, but reported knowing these were 525 caregivers and doctors. Since the nationwide survey of the bereaved families of cancer patients in Japan, 21% confirming a loved one's deathbed vision. They even have a word for it in Japan. 87% of the experience involved deceased persons, most commonly parents. Another Japanese study, this of 575 bereaved families, found a full 39% reported deathbed visions. So this isn't just a Christian or a Western thing. I remember when my father passed away, he was in the hospital here. And I've always thought that what happened to my wife was a coincidence. But the moment my dad died, she sat up in bed and knew it. The exact moment he died, or close to it, because when she sat up, the phone rang to tell her I was away on a trip, tell her that my dad had died. Coincidence? I mean, it's possible, right? But exactly at that time, now, many of you are caregivers, and we've all experienced people who've died, close people who've died. Does anyone want to share or ask a question? Oh,
Out there in experience I had, my son and I ran an adult foster care home for the elderly for 30 years. And a lady, they couldn't for the elderly, so we always tried to have 2 people there for better care and also support for each other. And it seemed like it happened just a minute ago. I was in trying to change her and roll her, and I said, well, I said, Mother, I'll just pick her up. It'll be easier for you to change the bed. And he did, and I finished. And I looked up and saw him standing holding this lady. It was so overwhelming. The love that we have for people that it was only last year that I shared that with my son, that how I emotionally felt about that moment. And it was interesting that Stevie, that month, this is 30 years ago, and was asked that we talked about this. I couldn't, beautiful. It wasn't words. I know.
And the other thing that I had wanted to do was to thank you to be able to try to what you like it happened yesterday. They did it language things. You know, I'm not part of it, but it is their attempt to tell whether you are remembering correctly or you remembering. Right, and what they found out is
They're not that that memories over time change. I can make up some really good stories about my youth, right? That are kind of sort of right, or this is kind of how I remember them. But what they find out is they've done this and they've taken this group that had been studying this for 50 years. One thing they did 40 years in is they found as many people as they could and asked them to tell them their experience. And then they recorded it. It was almost word for word identical. There wasn't any embellishment. There wasn't any taking away. There wasn't any change. It was exactly like it was 40 years ago. And they will say, they're all psychiatrists, they say, that memory doesn't work like that. Right? I mean, memory doesn't, you embellish or you take away, you forget, but they tell almost word for word identical. And when you said it's like it happened yesterday, that's another experience.
And for him,
that's to the amount of fear that they have. And as I was doing, follow the stuff. And he was there, and it was so vivid that we both 30 years later could recall that. And he also felt it as a beautiful experience, but he didn't know how I felt.
See, but that's what we're finding out has happened. That it's like me when I tell.
I mean, yeah, I mean, hey, come on, please, you know. I mean, that's the way I feel. Can't help it, you know, but because the second I tell it, it's like I teach it.
that's why I probably couldn't share it for so long.
Yeah, and then tell me, I mean, it's okay to be a quick fix for that. Yeah, maybe it's going to be vibration.
I think sometimes they put God in a box, so.
This guy, he is, ancient theologian, the well-known
Yeah, I like it. Feelings and also Kansas night sky is not a curiosity, something about which I could choose to be indifferent about. I don't, is it, as I initially intuited, connected in some mysterious way to everything else? And actually, but nothing by comparison counts for much, or at least fails to count in the same superlative way. In other words, he had this brief thing and it changed his life. Second, the theological idea of grace is taught. So the road to Damascus. Moses, the burning bush, Paul on the road to Damascus. Pentecost, it came down like sheets of fire. You know, the metaphor usage again. They seem as said to have come out of nowhere, like Paul's vision on the road to Damascus, uninvited. They just happened. So I experienced them as surprises and received them as gifts. My third conviction is that God can speak through the natural world. I met the Maker in the stars. I beheld the divine in a cemetery garden. So you have, once again, this sense of, I didn't do it. I didn't earn it. And like I said, I've not had one of those experiences, but I hold on to those who have had them. And I have become much more sympathetic to thinking that the experience they had was not just in their mind. Because if it was, there would be so many other characteristics that are not there. I'm beginning more and more also to appreciate. I was always a materialist and a pastor, which was sometimes a very difficult thing to deal with, because I didn't have any other image to work with. But the transmittal theory, where just because it happens together doesn't mean it's being caused. That there really is no matter, matter. There really is the more I read quantum mechanics, the more awed I become with the creation. It's just absolutely an amazing thing. And as who was it? One of the first. Gosh, was it Heisenberg? It might have been Heisenberg who said, "If you think you understand quantum mechanics, you're lying, or you don't." And I kind of feel the same way about religion. I'm a Christian. That's the tradition I grew up in. But if God is God, I have to believe that God didn't just manifest God's self in one way. I mean, it'd be a very small God if it only went to people who were Christians, wouldn't it? I mean, that's my feeling. And I know there are a lot of Christians who disagree with me. But I think arrogance and certitude are both sins. Well, yeah.
In terms of, is it working? Okay. In terms of life, we use a noun to describe life. I use nouns, and it'd be much better if we try to define life with just using verbs. What brings to mind once is a study that actually I heard it was on the radio. I don't read medical literature anymore, where somebody had gotten a bunch of bodies that were recently killed and pronounced dead, and in certain percentage of them, they could still my brainwaves going in there. It made me think about that in terms of they could apparently still hear the percentage of them, and you could put a question to them and whatnot. Use a brainwave pattern that would be appropriate for speech, but the speech center was dead, wasn't didn't function anymore longer. But the here these people were, apparently were all proper things dead, but you could find brainwaves on them again, and you could questions, and the brain pattern would go like it was going to put out a signal to the speech center to give an answer. So I think we're dealing with a process that's a lot more complicated than what we think it is, and a lot more imprecise in terms of what's happening there, and and wonder, with it.
And everything is a process. I mean, one of the things that stagnation is, well, let me go back. What's the first thing they teach you in hospice or in a pastor's school when you're doing visiting the sick? Always assume they can hear you. Always assume they can hear you. I know there have been several times when I've asked family, they're beginning to argue about who gets what, And I say, let's go out into the hallway. And you don't want to have this conversation at the foot of your father's bed or your mother's bed. We don't know, and we don't know so much. The other thing is, I was reading, there are 2 or 3 really great Roman Catholic theologians. This one is by the name of Haught, Haught, I think is the way he spells his name. And he talks about the problem with the church. Well, we want to be here all day. The problem is that we don't take evolution seriously enough. That evolution hasn't stopped. It may take different forms, but it hasn't stopped. We are still evolving. And he used the example of a 30-volume set of books, and I forget, it's like 500 pages to a book, and help me with this one. Doing that, humanity would appear on the last page of the 30th volume, halfway down, in 2 paragraphs before the end. That's where we are. The universe is 38 billion years old, and 100 years isn't even a blink. What we think takes a long time is almost instantaneous in terms of creation. And to think that we are the final product, just like we are, is a really arrogant sort of a position to say that
You're saying that we may have been better off with our forefathers with a different branch.
Well, I'm just saying that the branches are still being made, and I've been reading more. There's a guy, absolutely, Conway. He's a evolutionary paleontologist in Cambridge, and he has developed a theory that is really being taken on by a lot of people. It's called the theory of convergence. And that is that evolution is not blind, that there are only so many solutions to things. And if you if he uses the example, for example, an octopus and us and some other weird animal have the exact same eye formation. That there are only certain number of combinations. If you have to move from here to there, there's only certain number of that can happen to a body to get you from here to there. So he talks a lot about the idea of convergence, and well, that's a whole nother. You're not interested in that, but that's. And this book was written for general audience. It's not a theological book. It's written so that anybody can pick up the book and read it. And I would commend you to think your own thoughts, read it and see where it leaves you. I have no final answers. Thank you.